What begins as an ordinary flight quickly transforms into a race against time when Emily Harper, a dedicated flight attendant, notices something unusual about one of her passengers, a frightened teenage girl, and the controlling man seated beside her. With nothing more than a fleeting hand signal, the girl silently pleads for help, setting off a chain of events that will challenge Emily's courage, instincts, and resolve. As tensions rise in the confined space of the airplane, Emily must make split-second decisions to protect the girl without endangering the other passengers. But the man isn't about to let his control slip so easily, and the stakes grow higher with every passing moment. What unfolds is a gripping tale of bravery, humanity, and the extraordinary ripple effects of one person choosing to act. But can one small act of kindness truly change the course of someone's life? And what happens when a single moment of awareness sparks a movement that impacts countless others? Emily Harper stared at her reflection in the tiny, scratched mirror of the airport's staff restroom. Her dark brown hair was neatly pinned back, her crisp uniform immaculate. Yet, beneath the polished surface, exhaustion etched itself into her features. At 28, Emily loved her job as a flight attendant, but the long hours, constant travel, and fleeting human connections often left her feeling hollow. Today's flight was nothing special. Chicago to Los Angeles, a route she had worked dozens of times. She braced herself for 4 hours of routine service, mild turbulence, and the occasional demanding passenger. Adjusting her scarf, Emily forced a smile. "You can do this," she whispered to herself before heading to the gate. The Boeing 737 was already half full when she began assisting passengers. Families wrangled children into seats, business travelers hunched over laptops, and vacationers chatted excitedly about their plans. It was an ordinary scene, yet something caught Emily's eye as she made her way down the aisle. In row 12, a teenage girl sat stiffly by the window. Her pale skin and anxious demeanor stood in sharp contrast to the man seated beside her, whose tailored suit and gold watch exuded confidence. He appeared to be in his mid-40s, his movements deliberate, his presence commanding. "Good afternoon," Emily greeted them as she passed. The man glanced up, offering a thin smile. "Afternoon," he replied curtly. The girl, however, barely moved. Her hands fidgeted with the edge of her sweater, her gaze fixed on her lap. Something about her posture struck Emily a combination of fear and resignation, as though she were bracing herself for something unpleasant. Emily continued down the aisle, the interaction lingering in her mind. By the time the plane took off, she had almost convinced herself it was nothing. But when she began the beverage service an hour later, the unease returned. "Can I get you anything to drink?" Emily asked as she reached their row. The man in 12B ordered a coffee, then glanced at the girl. "Orange juice for her," he added, his tone possessive. Emily handed the drinks over, her professional smile unwavering. When she placed the orange juice on the girl's tray table, their eyes met briefly. In that moment, Emily saw something that made her heart skip a beat: fear. The girl's hand trembled as she reached for the drink. She made a quick motion with her fingers, curling her thumb into her palm and closing the other fingers over it. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Emily recognized it instantly. Months earlier, during a mandatory training seminar, she had learned about hand signals used by victims of abuse or trafficking to discreetly ask for help. The motion was simple, yet powerful, a silent plea. Emily's pulse quickened. Was she imagining things? Could she have misread the signal? She glanced at the man, who was obliviously stirring his coffee. The girl's hands were now folded tightly in her lap, as if nothing had happened. Emily nodded subtly, her mind racing. She needed to act, but caution was crucial. A false accusation could lead to disastrous consequences, but ignoring the situation could be even worse. Completing the beverage service, Emily returned to the galley. Her colleague, Jenna, noticed her tense expression. "Everything okay?" Jenna asked. Emily hesitated before speaking in a low voice. "I think there's something wrong with the girl in row 12A. She signaled for help." Jenna's eyes widened. "You sure?" "Not completely," Emily admitted, "but I cannot ignore it. I need to notify the captain." Jenna nodded. "I'll cover for you." Slipping into the rear lavatory, Emily pulled out her phone. While in-flight phone use was prohibited, every plane was equipped with an emergency communication system for contacting ground authorities. Emily typed out a message to the captain, detailing her observations. The reply came quickly. Noted. Proceed with caution. Authorities will meet us on landing. Emily felt a surge of relief. She wasn't alone in this. Yet as she stepped out of the bathroom, her resolve wavered. How could she protect the girl for the remaining 3 hours of the flight? As Emily returned to her duties, she noticed the man in 12B watching her. His gaze was sharp, probing, as though he suspected something. Emily forced herself to maintain a calm demeanor, but her every move felt scrutinized. When she passed by row 12 again, the girl risked a glance at Emily. Their eyes met briefly, and Emily gave her a small, reassuring nod. The girl's lips pressed together, as if holding back tears, but her posture straightened slightly. Emily couldn't stop thinking about the girl, her pale face, her trembling hands, her silent plea. What was her story? How had she ended up here, sitting next to a man who radiated control and menace? Emily's mind filled with questions, but one thought stood out. She had to help. As the plane soared through the clouds, the ordinary flight took on a new tension. Emily moved through her tasks with practiced efficiency, but her thoughts were consumed by the girl in 12A. She resolved to keep watching, waiting for the right moment to intervene. Emily didn't know how this would end, but one thing was certain. She wouldn't let the girl's signal go unanswered. The next few hours would test Emily in ways she had never anticipated, challenging her courage, her instincts, and her humanity. Unbeknownst to her, the small act of kindness she had shown by paying attention to a frightened girl would set off a chain of events that would change both of their lives forever. Claire Parker kept her eyes on the orange juice in front of her, her fingers trembling as they gripped the edges of the tray table. She could feel Marcus's gaze boring into her from the seat beside her, his presence an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. She replayed the brief interaction with the flight attendant in her mind. Had the woman understood her signal? Was she about to make everything worse? Claire's stomach churned with fear and doubt. Marcus had warned her of the consequences if she ever tried to escape. His threats had kept her compliant, but deep inside, a part of her refused to give up entirely. The flight had been Marcus's idea, a new destination, a new set of lies to spin. He told people he was her uncle, an easy explanation for why a quiet, withdrawn girl was always by his side. Claire had lost count of the days since he'd taken her. Time blurred in the shadow of constant fear. When the flight attendant had handed her the drink and their eyes met, Claire had made the signal on impulse. It was a desperate gamble, a silent cry for help. Now she worried that Marcus had noticed. His mood was unpredictable, and when he got angry, Claire always paid the price. Beside her, Marcus shifted in his seat, leaning closer. "You're awfully quiet," he murmured, his tone laced with suspicion. Claire forced a small smile. "I'm just tired," she said softly, hoping her voice wouldn't betray her panic. Marcus studied her for a long moment before leaning back. Claire exhaled silently, her hands clenching into fists beneath the table. Across the aisle, Emily Harper observed the scene from the galley, her heart heavy. She had never felt so helpless in her career. Usually, her role was to provide comfort, reassuring nervous flyers, calming children, or easing the tension of a delay. This was different. The stakes felt impossibly high. Every time Emily passed row 12, she felt Marcus's cold eyes tracking her movements. His aura of control unnerved her, but she wouldn't back down. She caught glimpses of Claire, who seemed to grow smaller with every passing minute. During her next pass, Emily stopped briefly beside Claire. "Do you need anything else?" she asked, keeping her voice casual. Claire glanced up, hesitating. She shook her head, but allowed her eyes to linger on Emily for a moment longer than necessary. That fleeting connection was enough to solidify Emily's resolve. Back in the galley, Jenna leaned in close. "What's the plan?" Emily bit her lip, thinking, "We need to get her away from him. Even if it's just for a few minutes, she needs to know she's safe." Jenna nodded. "I can create a distraction up front." Emily placed a hand on Jenna's arm. "Be careful. He's already suspicious." Moments later, Jenna's voice came over the intercom, announcing turbulence ahead and asking passengers to remain seated. As the announcement played, Emily moved to row 12, crouching down beside Claire. "Hi, sweetheart," Emily said softly, her tone as soothing as she could manage. "Would you like to come with me to the back for a moment? It's quieter there." Marcus stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "She's fine right here," he said sharply. Emily ignored him, her attention focused entirely on Claire. "It'll just be a moment. I'll bring her right back." Claire hesitated, fear warring with the flicker of hope in her chest. Emily extended a hand, her expression calm and reassuring. "It's okay," Emily whispered. With a shaky breath, Claire unbuckled her seatbelt and took Emily's hand. Marcus reached for her arm, but Emily moved quickly, placing herself between them. "Please stay seated, sir," she said firmly, her professional demeanor masking the adrenaline coursing through her. Emily guided Claire toward the galley, her heart pounding. Behind her, Marcus stood, his voice rising. "She's my niece. You can't just take her." Passengers turned to watch as Marcus's shouts echoed through the cabin. Emily glanced back to see Jenna stepping into Marcus's path, her voice calm but authoritative. "Sir, please sit down. We're experiencing turbulence," Jenna said. Emily ushered Claire into the galley and closed the curtain. She knelt in front of the trembling girl, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You're safe," Emily said gently. "We're going to help you. Just tell me what you need." Tears welled in Claire's eyes, but she nodded. "I need to get away from him," she whispered. "He's not my uncle. He's lying." Emily's chest tightened at the raw fear in Claire's voice. "I believe you," she said. "The police will be waiting for us when we land. You just have to hang on a little longer." Claire wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater, her breathing uneven but steadier. For the first time in weeks, she felt the faintest glimmer of hope. Meanwhile, Marcus's temper flared as he argued with Jenna. "You don't understand. She's my responsibility." Jenna stood her ground, keeping her voice calm but unyielding. "Please return to your seat, sir. The captain has been informed of the situation, and we are handling it." As Marcus reluctantly sat down, his glare burned into the back of Jenna's head. Emily returned to the galley moments later, exchanging a brief, tense glance with Jenna. "We need to keep him contained until we land," Emily murmured. "Got it," Jenna replied. Over the next hour, the tension in the cabin was palpable. Marcus's agitation grew with every minute, while Claire stayed hidden in the galley, clinging to Emily like a lifeline. Emily's thoughts raced. Had they done enough? Would the authorities arrive in time? She pushed her fears aside, focusing on the girl in front of her. "You're so brave," Emily said quietly, her hand resting over Claire's. "Just a little longer, okay?" Claire nodded, her grip tightening. For the first time, she believed that someone cared enough to help her. Emily Harper couldn't shake the weight pressing on her chest. Standing in the galley with Claire huddled close, she realized this situation demanded more than calm reassurance and careful planning. It required precision, courage, and trust in a team she now relied on more than ever. Her colleague Jenna whispered urgently, breaking Emily's racing thoughts. "Marcus is watching every move. He keeps glancing back here." Emily nodded, keeping her voice low. "We need to keep him contained without pushing him over the edge. If he becomes violent, things could spiral out of control." Claire sat on the small jump seat, her knees pulled to her chest, her hands clutching a blanket Emily had given her. Though her body still trembled, her breathing was steadier. Emily crouched in front of her, careful to maintain a steady, comforting tone. "Claire, I need you to trust me," Emily began. "The police will be waiting for us when we land, but until then, we need to stay calm. Do you think you can do that?" Claire's eyes were wide and filled with uncertainty, but she nodded. "What if he tries to hurt someone?" she asked softly. Emily's heart ached for the girl's fear. "He won't. We've got people watching him, and we're ready to handle it if anything happens. You're not alone in this, okay?" Jenna peeked around the curtain and returned with a quick update. "Marcus is talking to the passenger beside him. He's acting calmer, but I can tell he's simmering." Emily felt a flicker of unease. The last thing they needed was for Marcus to involve other passengers or attempt a confrontation before they landed. Turning to Jenna, she said, Can you bring Frank back here? Frank, the retired police officer seated a few rows up, had offered his help earlier. Emily knew they needed his presence, now more than ever. Jenna nodded and slipped away, leaving Emily alone with Claire for a moment. The plane vibrated with the steady hum of engines, a sound Emily usually found soothing. Tonight, it felt like an ominous backdrop to the ticking clock in her head. Every minute mattered. Jenna returned moments later, Frank in tow. The man's calm, authoritative demeanor was a welcome sight. "What's the situation?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Emily explained quickly, her words clipped with urgency. "We need to keep Marcus in his seat. The police will take over when we land, but if he tries anything, we'll need backup." Frank nodded. "I'll move to the seat directly behind him. If he stands or starts causing trouble, I'll step in." "Thank you," Emily said, her voice filled with gratitude. As Frank moved toward his new position, Emily turned her attention back to Claire. "Stay back here with Jenna. I'll be close, okay?" Claire's hands tightened on the blanket, but she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Emily smiled gently. "You're the brave one, Claire." The cabin felt taut with unspoken tension as Emily resumed her duties. She moved down the aisle, her eyes always flicking back to row 12. Marcus sat stiffly, his hands gripping the armrests. Frank was positioned behind him, a quiet but unmistakable presence. Marcus turned abruptly as Emily passed by. "Excuse me," he said, his voice clipped. "Where is my niece?" Emily stopped, her professional mask firmly in place. "She wasn't feeling well, sir. She's resting in the back." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "I'd like to see her." "I'm sorry," Emily replied evenly. "It's best if she stays where she is until we land. We're making sure she's comfortable." Marcus didn't respond, but his jaw tightened, and Emily could feel the barely contained tension radiating from him. As she moved toward the galley, she caught Frank's subtle nod of reassurance. Emily exhaled softly, grateful for his quiet support. In the galley, Jenna was talking softly with Claire, who seemed a fraction more relaxed. Emily joined them, her voice calm. "How are you holding up?" Claire hesitated, then said, "Okay, I think." "That's good," Emily said, offering a small smile. "We're almost there." A sudden jolt of turbulence rattled the plane, and the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated as we experience some light turbulence. We'll begin our descent into Los Angeles shortly." Emily glanced at Jenna, who met her gaze with a knowing look. The descent meant they were one step closer to safety, but it also meant less time to defuse any potential outbursts from Marcus. Jenna leaned in close. "If he tries to leave his seat during the descent, what's the plan?" Emily thought quickly. "We keep the aisle blocked and call Frank if needed. Hopefully, the seatbelt sign will be enough to keep him in place." Jenna nodded. "Let's hope." Marcus sat stiffly in his seat, his frustration growing with every passing minute. He glanced over his shoulder at the galley, his view obscured by the curtain. His instincts told him something wasn't right. He reached for the call button, summoning Emily. She arrived promptly, her expression neutral. "Yes, sir." Marcus's tone was icy. "I demand to see my niece. She's been gone long enough." Emily remained composed. "As I mentioned, sir, she's resting. We'll be landing soon, and you'll see her then." Marcus clenched his jaw, his patience clearly thinning. "You don't understand. I'm responsible for her." "I do understand, sir," Emily replied, her voice calm but firm. "And it's my responsibility to ensure all passengers are safe and comfortable. Please remain seated." Marcus's glare was sharp enough to cut steel, but he said nothing further. As the plane began its final approach, Emily's focus sharpened. She and Jenna had rehearsed every possible scenario, and now it was a matter of execution. She exchanged a brief glance with Frank, who gave her a reassuring nod. In the galley, Claire sat quietly, her face pale but resolute. Emily knelt beside her one last time. "We're almost there," she said softly. Claire nodded, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "I'm ready." The plane touched down smoothly, and Emily felt a wave of relief. She knew the hardest part was behind them, but she also knew the next few minutes were critical. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated as we await instructions from the ground crew. Thank you for your cooperation." Emily moved quickly to the galley, where Jenna stood with Claire. "It's time," Emily said. Jenna helped Claire to her feet, and together they led her toward the rear exit, where police officers were already waiting. Marcus stood abruptly, but Frank blocked his path, his voice firm. "Sit down, sir," Frank said. Emily ushered Claire down the stairs and into the arms of the waiting officers. Claire's small hand clutched hers tightly until the very last moment. Her whispered, "Thank you," etched forever in Emily's heart. The weight in Emily Harper's chest lightened slightly as Claire was led away by the police at the rear of the plane. For a fleeting moment, relief coursed through her. Claire was safe now. But Emily knew this wasn't over. Marcus Steele was still on the plane, and his growing agitation was palpable. Inside the cabin, passengers stirred in their seats, exchanging confused whispers. The flight's unusual delay at the gate was beginning to raise questions. Emily stepped back into the aisle, her professional demeanor firmly in place, while Jenna worked quietly to calm the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jenna announced over the intercom, her voice calm, "we appreciate your patience as we follow instructions from the ground crew. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Marcus's seatbelt was already unbuckled. His legs jiggled restlessly as he glared at the curtain separating the galley from the rest of the cabin. His fingers drummed an angry rhythm on the armrest. Emily could see it coming, the storm brewing behind his tightly clenched jaw. Emily exchanged a glance with Frank, seated directly behind Marcus. The retired officer sat upright, his hands resting on his knees. His presence was a quiet reminder of control, a steadying force in the growing tension. Marcus suddenly rose to his feet, his frame towering over the seated passengers. "I need to know what's going on," he demanded, his voice sharp enough to cut through the low hum of whispers. Emily approached him calmly, keeping her voice measured. "Sir, I need you to sit down. We're still waiting for clearance to disembark." "Where is my niece?" Marcus snapped, his words clipped and cold. Emily's heart raced, but she didn't let it show. "She's being cared for by the ground crew," she said firmly. "Please remain seated." Marcus's nostrils flared as he took a step forward. His movement was halted by Frank, who rose to his feet with deliberate authority. "Sit down, sir," Frank said, his tone even but commanding. "Let's not make this worse for you." The cabin fell silent. All eyes were on Marcus, whose face flushed with anger. For a moment, Emily thought he might lash out, but something in Frank's steady gaze seemed to deter him. With a frustrated huff, Marcus dropped back into his seat, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. In the galley, Jenna monitored the situation closely, her heart pounding. She knew Emily and Frank could handle Marcus, but the tension was unbearable. She thought about Claire, how small and fragile she had seemed as she was guided off the plane. Jenna hoped the girl was finally feeling safe, but she couldn't shake the image of her trembling hands clutching that blanket. The police officers waiting outside were a comfort, but Jenna also knew that Marcus wouldn't go quietly. Every second they remained on the plane increased the risk of an outburst. She peeked through the curtain and saw Marcus sitting stiffly, his jaw clenched. Emily was standing a few feet away, her posture alert. Frank remained behind Marcus, a silent enforcer. Jenna took a deep breath and stepped into the aisle to join Emily. "We're almost there," Jenna whispered to her. Emily nodded. "Let's just get through the next few minutes." The cabin door finally opened, and the first officer stepped inside. Their presence brought an audible sigh of relief from the passengers. Emily gestured discreetly toward row 12, where Marcus sat glaring at the approaching officers. "Mr. Steele," one of the officers said, his voice firm, "please stand up and come with us." Marcus's lips curled into a sneer. "What is this about?" he demanded. "I haven't done anything wrong. Please cooperate," the officer replied, unfazed by Marcus's hostility. The tension in the cabin rose as Marcus remained seated, his defiance clear. Frank stepped forward, his voice steady but insistent. "Marcus," he said calmly, "you can either go with him now, or we'll have to escalate this. Do the smart thing." Marcus glanced around the cabin, his gaze landing briefly on Emily. She met his glare without flinching, her composure unwavering despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Finally, Marcus stood, his movements deliberate and slow. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, his voice dripping with disdain. The officers flanked him, guiding him down the aisle and off the plane. As soon as Marcus was out of sight, a collective exhale swept through the cabin. Emily remained in the aisle for a moment, her hands resting on the back of the seat. The adrenaline of the past few hours began to ebb, leaving her exhausted but resolute. She met Jenna's gaze and saw the same relief reflected in her friend's eyes. Passengers began murmuring amongst themselves, their curiosity piqued by the dramatic turn of events. Emily cleared her throat, addressing the cabin with a reassuring smile. "Thank you for your patience, everyone," she said. "We'll begin deplaning shortly. If you have any questions or concerns, please let us know." Jenna moved to the front of the plane, assisting passengers as they began gathering their belongings. Emily stayed near row 12, her presence a quiet anchor for the passengers still processing what had happened. Frank approached her, his expression calm but concerned. "You handled that well," he said. "Thank you," Emily replied. "I couldn't have done it without you." Frank gave her a small nod. "That girl Claire, she's lucky you noticed. Most people wouldn't have." Emily felt a lump rise in her throat, but swallowed it down. "She's brave," she said softly. "I just did what anyone should do." As the last passengers deplaned, Emily and Jenna lingered in the galley, their exhaustion evident. The once chaotic cabin was now quiet, the tension replaced by an overwhelming sense of relief. "Do you think she'll be okay?" Jenna asked, her voice hesitant. Emily leaned against the counter, her arms crossed. "I hope so. She has a long road ahead, but at least she's safe now." The two women stood in silence for a moment, each lost in their thoughts. "I keep thinking," Jenna said after a pause. "What if we hadn't noticed? What if she hadn't made that signal?" Emily shook her head. "I don't even want to think about that." Jenna nodded, her expression somber. "It's scary how easily something like this can go unnoticed." Emily's jaw tightened. "That's why we have to pay attention. You never know when someone might need help." As they gathered their belongings and prepared to leave the plane, Emily couldn't shake the image of Claire's tearful eyes and trembling hands. The experience had left an indelible mark on her, a reminder of the profound impact one moment of attention and kindness could have. The airport terminal was bustling with activity, but Claire Parker barely noticed the commotion around her. She sat in a quiet room near the police station within the terminal, clutching the blanket Emily had given her. Two officers sat nearby, speaking softly with her parents, who had just arrived. Their tearful reunion had been overwhelming, and Claire was still processing the surreal reality that she was finally safe. Her parents' faces were etched with worry and relief as they listened to the officers explain the steps ahead. Meanwhile, Claire remained silent, her gaze fixed on her lap. Her body was free, but her mind remained trapped in the memories of Marcus's threats and control. In another room, Marcus Steele sat handcuffed at a metal table, his expression unreadable. Two detectives stood opposite him, their voices calm but firm as they asked questions. Marcus, however, refused to cooperate. He leaned back in his chair, his tone defiant. "I've done nothing wrong," he said, his voice laced with disdain. "She's my niece. This is a misunderstanding." The officers exchanged a glance. "Marcus, we have evidence. Witnesses. Your lies won't hold up." Marcus's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. "You're wasting your time." Meanwhile, Emily Harper stood in the airport staff lounge, sipping a cup of lukewarm coffee. Her hands were steady, but the events of the day weighed heavily on her. Jenna sat beside her, scrolling through her phone for updates on the situation. "Looks like they've got Marcus in custody," Jenna said, breaking the silence. "They're charging him with kidnapping and trafficking. He's not going anywhere." Emily nodded, her gaze distant. "Good," she murmured. Jenna leaned closer, concern evident in her expression. "Are you okay?" Emily forced a small smile. "I'm fine. Just processing everything." Jenna placed a hand on Emily's arm. "You did something incredible today. You saved her." Emily shook her head. "She saved herself. She had the courage to ask for help. I just listened. Jenna's phone buzzed with a new notification, and her eyebrows lifted. The story's already in the news, she said, tilting the screen toward Emily. The headline read, "Flight attendant helps save trafficking victim midair." Emily sighed, the weight of the attention sinking in. "I didn't do it for recognition," she said quietly. "I know," Jenna replied. "But maybe this will help more people pay attention. Maybe it'll save someone else." In the quiet room with her parents, Claire finally found her voice. "I thought no one would notice," she said, her voice trembling. Her mother reached for her hand, tears streaming down her face. "You're so brave, sweetheart. We'll get through this together." Claire's father nodded, his jaw tight with suppressed emotion. "You're safe now. That man will never hurt you again." The officers assured them that Claire would have access to trauma counselors and resources to help her recover. As the conversation continued, a knock at the door interrupted them. Emily entered hesitantly, her expression soft. "Hi, Claire," she said gently. Claire's face lit up with recognition, and she quickly stood. Without hesitation, she wrapped her arms around Emily in a tight hug. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Emily held her close, her throat tightening. "You're so strong, Claire. I'm proud of you." When Claire pulled back, her eyes shone with a mixture of gratitude and determination. "You didn't have to help me, but you did. I'll never forget it." The encounter left Emily both humbled and inspired. Back in the lounge, as she prepared to leave for her next flight, she couldn't stop thinking about Claire's words. "She's safe now," Jenna said as she gathered her bag. "But how many others aren't?" Emily replied, her voice filled with quiet resolve. Jenna paused, studying Emily. "What are you thinking?" Emily met her friend's gaze, a spark of determination in her eyes. "We need to do more. This can't just be a one-time thing. People need to know what to look for, what to do." Jenna nodded slowly. "You're right. Let's figure out how." Later that evening, Emily sat in her small apartment, scrolling through her emails. One caught her attention, a message from Frank, the retired officer who had helped during the flight. Subject: "Great work today. Emily, I wanted to thank you again for staying calm and focused during such a tense situation. Your instincts and courage made all the difference. If you ever want to talk about how we can improve awareness and training for situations like this, I'm happy to help. Best, Frank." Emily stared at the screen for a moment, then began typing a reply. "Frank, thank you for your support today. I agree that we need better training and awareness. I'd like to discuss this further. Let me know when you're available. Emily." As she hit send, Emily felt a flicker of hope. The day had been harrowing, but it wasn't the end, it was a beginning. Meanwhile, Claire lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling. Her parents had insisted on staying in a hotel near the airport, too shaken to return home just yet. For the first time in weeks, Claire felt a sense of safety, but the memories of Marcus's control still haunted her. She thought about Emily, the flight attendant who had noticed her signal and risked everything to help. Claire's fingers traced the edges of the blanket Emily had given her. It wasn't just an object. It was a reminder that someone had cared enough to see her, to listen, to act. Her thoughts turned to the other girls Marcus had mentioned in passing, the ones he claimed were lost causes. Were they still out there? Could anyone save them? Claire closed her eyes, a new resolve forming in her mind. She had survived, but she wouldn't stop there. She wanted to help others like her, others who felt unseen and unheard. The night settled over the city, but for Emily and Claire, the events of the day marked a turning point. Each of them, in their own way, was beginning a journey they hadn't anticipated. One driven by courage, resilience, and the belief that even small actions could change lives. 2 weeks had passed since the flight that had changed everything, but for Emily Harper, the memories remained vivid. The feeling of Claire's trembling hands, the sharp glare of Marcus's defiant gaze, and the tension that had hung in the air like a storm about to break, those moments stayed with her, reshaping her perspective on her job and her purpose. Emily's usual routine of shuttling between cities felt different now. Every passenger, every interaction, carried a new weight. She found herself scanning faces more intently, reading body language with heightened awareness. Her training had been valuable, but she realized it wasn't enough. That was why she was here, sitting in a quiet corner of a downtown cafe, laptop open and a notebook filled with scrawled ideas at her side. Across from her sat Frank, the retired officer whose steady presence during the flight had been invaluable. "This could really make a difference," Emily said, gesturing to her notes. "If airlines had more comprehensive training, not just the basics, but real, practical scenarios, think about how many lives we could change." Frank nodded, his coffee untouched as he scanned her ideas. "You're onto something, Emily. The signs are subtle. Most people wouldn't even know what to look for." "That's what bothers me," Emily replied. "How many Claire Parkers are out there, sitting in plain sight, hoping someone will notice?" Frank leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "The challenge is convincing the airlines to invest in this. They'll worry about costs, liability, and potential backlash. But if we frame it as an opportunity to lead in safety and responsibility, they might listen." Emily scribbled a note in her book. "We start small. One airline, one training session. If it works, the success speaks for itself." Frank smiled faintly. "You're determined. I like that." While Emily and Frank strategized, Claire Parker was beginning her own journey toward healing and purpose. She had returned home with her parents, but the adjustment was harder than she'd imagined. Her room felt both familiar and alien, the cheerful posters and keepsakes a stark contrast to the darkness she had endured. Her parents hovered protectively, eager to help but unsure how. Claire appreciated their love, but she often felt like she was moving through a fog, her emotions swinging between gratitude and despair. One afternoon, her mother knocked gently on her door. "Claire, someone's here to see you." Curious, Claire followed her mother to the living room. There, sitting on the couch, was Emily Harper. "Hi, Claire," Emily said warmly, standing as Claire entered. Claire's face lit up with surprise. "Emily, what are you doing here?" "I wanted to check on you," Emily replied. "See how you're doing." Claire sat down across from her, a small smile breaking through her usual guarded expression. "I'm okay, I guess. It's been hard." Emily nodded, her voice gentle. "That's normal. What you went through is unimaginable, but you're incredibly strong." They talked for nearly an hour, the conversation flowing easily. Emily shared how the experience had inspired her to push for better awareness and training, and Claire found herself opening up about her own hopes. "I've been thinking about the other girls Marcus talked about," Claire said, her voice quiet but steady. "He said there were more like me, and I can't stop wondering if they're still out there. I want to help them somehow." Emily felt a swell of pride. "You already are, Claire. By sharing your story, you're shining a light on something people often overlook. That takes so much courage." Claire's smile grew. For the first time in weeks, she felt a spark of purpose or reason to look forward. That evening, Emily returned home feeling renewed. Meeting with Claire had reinforced her commitment to the initiative she and Frank were developing. They had already outlined the basics: workshops for flight crews, detailed case studies, and partnerships with advocacy groups. Her phone buzzed with a new email, the sender's name catching her attention. It was Captain Evelyn Rhodes, the pilot from that fateful flight. Subject: "Let's talk. Emily, I've heard about the work you're doing with Frank. I want to help. Let's discuss how we can get this off the ground literally." "Captain Rhodes." Emily grinned, immediately typing a response. The captain's involvement was a game changer. With her support, they could gain credibility and open doors that might otherwise remain closed. The next day, Emily, Frank, and Captain Rhodes met in a conference room at the airline's headquarters. The captain, a confident woman with decades of experience, wasted no time getting to the point. "This is a smart initiative," she said, her tone authoritative. "But you'll need more than good intentions to convince the higher-ups. Airlines operate on tight margins. They'll want to see the value, both financial and reputational." Frank nodded. "We've been working on that. If we can show how this reduces liability and enhances passenger safety, it becomes an investment, not a cost." Emily added, "And there's the human element. Stories like Claire's resonate. Passengers trust airlines that prioritize safety and vigilance." The captain leaned back in her chair, considering their points. "You're right. Let's build a proposal that's airtight. I'll help you pitch it to the executive team." As they worked late into the evening, a sense of camaraderie grew among the group. They shared a common purpose, driven by the belief that small actions could create ripple effects of change. By the time they finalized their presentation, Emily felt both exhausted and exhilarated. "This is it," she said, holding up the neatly bound proposal. "The first step towards something bigger." Frank clapped her on the back. "We've got this." Captain Rhodes smiled. "Let's make it count." Back in her room, Claire sat at her desk, a notebook open in front of her. She had started jotting down her thoughts, memories of her ordeal, reflections on her rescue, and ideas for helping others. Her phone buzzed with a message from Emily. "I'm meeting with the airline execs tomorrow to pitch the training program. Your story inspired this, Claire. Thank you for your bravery." Claire's chest tightened with emotion. She replied quickly, "Good luck. I know you'll do amazing things. Thank you for believing in me." As she set her phone down, Claire felt a growing sense of hope. She wasn't just a victim anymore, she was a survivor, and she was ready to make a difference. The tide was turning. Emily's initiative, Claire's resolve, and the team's shared vision were setting the stage for something transformative. What had started as a desperate signal for help was now becoming a movement, a powerful force for change. Emily Harper stood outside the glass-walled conference room at the airline's headquarters, clutching the proposal binder tightly to her chest. She took a deep breath, the steady hum of office activity behind her blending into white noise. Captain Evelyn Rhodes, poised as ever in her Navy uniform, stood beside her. "You're ready," Captain Rhodes said with a reassuring nod. Emily nodded, though her heart pounded. The stakes felt enormous. If the executives rejected their plan, it could set them back months or worse, stop the initiative entirely. But if they succeeded, it could be the first step toward meaningful, widespread change. "Let's do this," Emily said, her voice steadier than she felt. Inside the room, the airline's executive team waited. The CEO, a sharp-eyed man in his early 50s, gestured for them to sit. Emily, Frank, and Captain Rhodes took their places at the table, their proposal neatly stacked in front of them. "Thank you for joining us," the CEO began, his tone professional but brisk. "We've reviewed your outline. Now we'd like to hear your pitch." Emily glanced at Captain Rhodes, who gave her a subtle nod to proceed. Emily began, her voice gaining confidence with each word. "This proposal isn't just about preventing trafficking, it's about creating a culture of awareness and safety. Our training program equips flight crews to recognize subtle signs of distress and act decisively, without disrupting operations or alarming passengers. This is about being proactive and saving lives." Frank followed, his tone authoritative. "From a legal perspective, implementing this program could significantly reduce liability. By equipping staff with actionable tools, the airline demonstrates due diligence in addressing a pressing global issue." Captain Rhodes concluded the presentation, her experience lending weight to their arguments. As flight crew, we're often the first and only line of defense in these situations. This training is not just practical, it's essential. Imagine the reputation boost for being the airline that leads the industry in combating human trafficking. The room fell silent as the executives exchanged glances. The CEO leaned forward, his fingers steepled. "This is compelling," he said. "But what about costs? Additional training and resources require significant investment. How do we justify it to shareholders?" Emily had prepared for this question. She opened the proposal to a page detailing a phased implementation plan. "We suggest starting with a pilot program," she explained. "Focus on a single route or region, gather data, and refine the training based on real-world results. This minimizes upfront costs while demonstrating effectiveness." The CEO nodded thoughtfully. "All right, we'll take this under advisement. You'll hear from us within a week." As the meeting ended, Emily felt a flicker of hope. The team's proposal had been well received, but the waiting game had begun. Meanwhile, Claire Parker sat at her desk, her notebook open and pen poised. Since her ordeal, writing had become her outlet, a way to process her emotions and give shape to the storm of thoughts swirling in her mind. Her phone buzzed with a text from Emily. "Meeting went well. Fingers crossed. Keep being amazing." Claire smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. Emily's unwavering belief in her was a lifeline. She returned to her writing, penning words that felt equal parts cathartic and terrifying. She described the moment on the plane when she had made the hand signal, the fear and hope mingling as she locked eyes with Emily. Finishing the page, she stared at her words. For the first time, she considered sharing her story publicly, not just with Emily, but with others who might need to hear it. Days passed before Emily received the email she'd been waiting for. Sitting at her small kitchen table, she opened her laptop, her breath catching as she read the subject line. Approved. Training Program Pilot Initiative. Her excitement bubbled over as she read the details. The airline had agreed to launch the pilot program, focusing on its busiest domestic routes. The first training session was scheduled for the following month, and Emily would be leading it alongside Frank and Captain Rhodes. She immediately called Frank, her voice brimming with enthusiasm. They said yes. We're doing this. Frank chuckled. I knew we would. This is just the beginning. Emily felt a swell of pride and purpose. We're going to make this count. The following weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. Emily worked tirelessly with Frank and Captain Rhodes to develop the training materials, incorporating real-life scenarios and clear, actionable steps for flight crews. One evening, as Emily reviewed her notes, her phone buzzed with a call from Claire. Emily. Claire's voice sounded nervous but determined. Claire, how are you? I'm good. I've been thinking. I want to share my story. If it helps even one person, it'll be worth it. Emily's heart swelled with admiration. That's incredible, Claire. Are you sure you're ready? I think so, Claire replied. I don't want what happened to me to define me, but I want it to matter. Claire's decision marked a turning point. With Emily's help, she connected with a local advocacy group that offered guidance on sharing her story safely and effectively. Together, they planned for Claire to speak at the airline's inaugural training session, her firsthand experience adding a powerful, personal element to the program. When the day of the first training session arrived, the room was packed with flight attendants, pilots, and ground staff. Emily stood at the front, her nerves buzzing, but her voice steady as she began. This training isn't just about recognizing signs of trafficking. It's about empathy, vigilance, and taking action when it matters most. Frank and Captain Rhodes led the group through practical exercises, showing them how to observe, assess, and respond. The attendees leaned forward, engaged and attentive. Finally, it was Claire's turn. Emily introduced her, her voice tinged with pride. This is Claire Parker. She's here today because someone noticed her silent cry for help. Her bravery inspires everything we're doing. Claire stepped to the podium, her hands shaking slightly. Taking a deep breath, she began to speak. A few weeks ago, I thought no one could see me. I thought I was invisible. But one person did see me, and that changed everything. As Claire shared her story, the room grew silent. Her voice wavered at times, but her determination shone through. By the time she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The applause that followed was thunderous, but for Claire, the real reward was the sense of release. She had reclaimed her voice. After the session, several attendees approached Claire to thank her. One young flight attendant said, "Your story is going to stay with me forever. I'll always be watching now." Emily watched the scene unfold, her heart full. The pilot program had been a success, but more importantly, it had sparked a deeper commitment in everyone who participated. That evening, as Emily sat with Frank and Captain Rhodes, they reflected on the day. "This is just the start," Frank said. Captain Rhodes nodded. "One step at a time, but we're heading in the right direction." Emily smiled, and Claire's leading the way. They raised their glasses in a quiet toast, the weight of the day giving way to hope. The applause from the first training session still echoed in Emily Harper's mind as she sat in her apartment that evening, reflecting on the day. It wasn't just the success of the program that filled her with pride, it was Claire. Watching her stand at the podium, reclaiming her voice and inspiring others, had been a moment Emily would never forget. The feedback from the session had been overwhelmingly positive. Flight crews expressed their gratitude, saying the training was not only practical, but also deeply moving. Some admitted they'd never thought about trafficking as something that could happen right in front of them. Others shared how the program had changed their perspective, making them more vigilant and empathetic. The airline's leadership team took notice. By the following week, they had expanded the pilot program to include more routes and were already discussing how to integrate it into standard training. For Emily, Frank, Captain Rhodes, and Claire, the momentum was exhilarating. But the work was far from over. Claire Parker felt a mix of pride and exhaustion as she returned home after the training session. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she had taken control of her story. But speaking about her experience had also reopened wounds she was still learning to navigate. Her parents were waiting in the living room when she walked through the door. "You were incredible," her mother said, pulling her into a hug. Her father nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "You made a difference today, Claire. We're so proud of you." Claire smiled, though the weight of the day lingered. After a quiet dinner, she retreated to her room and opened her notebook, scribbling down her thoughts. "Today was hard but worth it. Sharing my story felt like peeling back a bandage that stung, but it was necessary. If even one person helped someone because of what I said, it will all be worth it." As she wrote, Claire thought about the other girls Marcus had mentioned in passing, the ones he'd claimed were beyond help. She couldn't stop wondering if they were still out there, waiting for someone to see them. She reached for her phone and sent a message to Emily. "What's next? How do we reach more people?" Emily received Claire's message the next morning as she prepared for another meeting at the airline's headquarters. She smiled, inspired by Claire's determination. "We're just getting started," she replied. "Let's meet this weekend to brainstorm. There's so much we can do." The meeting with the airline's executives was another step forward. The success of the pilot program had caught the attention of industry leaders, and other airlines were beginning to inquire about adopting similar training. Captain Rhodes presented a detailed report on the program's impact, highlighting its effectiveness and the overwhelmingly positive feedback from staff. Emily followed with a proposal to expand the program further, suggesting partnerships with advocacy groups to strengthen its reach. The CEO leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "This is impressive work," he said. "We'll move forward with the expansion. Keep us updated on the partnerships." As Emily and her team left the meeting, a wave of excitement washed over her. The program was gaining traction, and for the first time, she felt like their vision of creating systemic change was within reach. That weekend, Emily, Claire, Frank, and Captain Rhodes gathered at a small community center to brainstorm their next steps. The atmosphere was charged with a sense of purpose. "We've got the airline on board," Emily began, "but we need to think bigger. How do we reach people outside of aviation?" Frank tapped a pen against his notebook. "We could partner with schools. Educating young people about trafficking could make a huge difference." Claire nodded, her voice steady. "When I learned about the hand signal in school, it saved my life. If more people knew about it, maybe they could save someone else." "That's a great idea," Captain Rhodes said. "What about businesses too? Hotels, transportation services, they all intersect with this issue." Emily jotted down notes, her mind racing with possibilities. "We'll need funding to expand, but if we frame this as a community effort, I think we can rally support." As they worked late into the evening, the group sketched out a roadmap for their initiative. They decided to formalize their efforts by creating a nonprofit organization that would focus on education, training, and survivor support. "What should we call it?" Claire asked. Frank leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "How about Signals of Hope?" Emily smiled. "It's perfect." Over the next few months, Signals of Hope began to take shape. Emily worked tirelessly to build partnerships with schools, advocacy groups, and local businesses. Frank used his connections in law enforcement to develop training materials for police officers and first responders. Captain Rhodes continued to push for broader adoption of the airline program, meeting with industry leaders to advocate for change. Claire became the heart of the organization. Her story resonated deeply with audiences, and her courage inspired countless others to join the cause. She spoke at schools, community centers, and conferences, always emphasizing the importance of paying attention and acting. One day, after a speaking event at a local high school, a student approached Claire with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," the girl said. "I think my friend might be in trouble, and I didn't know what to do. Now I know how to help." Claire felt a lump rise in her throat. "You can make a difference," she said gently. Never underestimate the power of noticing. As signals of hope grew, so did its impact. Schools began incorporating trafficking awareness into their curricula. Businesses trained their staff to recognize signs of exploitation. Survivors reached out for support, finding a community that understood their pain and celebrated their resilience. For Emily, the work was exhausting but deeply fulfilling. She often thought back to the moment on the plane when Claire had made the hand signal. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but it had sparked something powerful, a ripple of change that was now transforming lives. One evening, as Emily reviewed grant applications in her small office, she received a call from Claire. "I was thinking about something Marcus said," Claire began, her voice hesitant. Emily tensed. "What did he say?" "He talked about other girls," Claire continued. "I think we need to find them." Emily's heart ached at the thought. "We'll do everything we can," she promised. Claire's determination was unwavering. "I survived because someone saw me. Now it's my turn to see them." Claire Parker's words echoed in Emily Harper's mind long after their phone call ended. "I survived because someone saw me. Now it's my turn to see them." Emily sat at her desk late into the night, her laptop glowing in the dim room. A spreadsheet listed contacts from advocacy groups, law enforcement, and survivor networks, people who might help uncover the truth about the other girls Marcus had mentioned. If they could find even one, it would mean everything. The thought was overwhelming, but Emily reminded herself of the strength Claire had shown. If Claire could face her trauma and use it to fuel her purpose, then Emily could too. The next morning, she called Frank and Captain Rhodes to discuss their next steps. "We need to work with law enforcement to dig deeper into Marcus's connections," Emily said. Frank, ever the strategist, nodded. "We'll need solid leads, but if anyone has information, it'll be the advocacy groups. They hear things the police sometimes miss." Captain Rhodes leaned forward, her voice resolute. "Count me in. I'll reach out to my contacts in transportation. Traffickers rely on travel networks. We might find a thread to pull." Meanwhile, Claire began sharing her idea with the Signals of Hope team. Though the thought of searching for other victims terrified her, it also gave her a renewed sense of purpose. If she could help even one person avoid what she had endured, it would be worth it. At her next speaking engagement, a conference for social workers and educators, Claire ended her talk with a direct appeal. "Marcus Steele wasn't just my captor," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "He told me there were others like me, girls he controlled and exploited. I survived because someone saw me, but I can't forget the ones who might still be out there. If you have any information, no matter how small, please come forward. Together, we can save them." The room was silent for a moment before erupting in applause. Afterward, attendees approached Claire with words of encouragement and, more importantly, offers of assistance. The following week, Emily, Claire, and Frank met with a local anti-trafficking organization to review case files and gather potential leads. The office was modest but buzzing with energy, its walls lined with posters about spotting the signs of trafficking. An advocate named Maya, who had been working with survivors for over a decade, greeted them warmly. "Thank you for coming," Maya said as she led them into a small conference room. "We've been following your work, and it's inspiring to see how much you've accomplished." Emily nodded, her voice earnest. "We're just getting started. Marcus mentioned other girls, and we want to do everything we can to find them." Maya opened a folder filled with reports. "This is what we have on trafficking activity linked to Marcus Steele and his known associates. It's not much, but it might give you a place to start." Claire sat quietly, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Seeing the files was difficult, but she forced herself to focus. These weren't just storying, they were lives, and she was determined to help. As Maya reviewed the reports, one detail caught Emily's attention. "Wait," Emily said, pointing to a name in the file. "This transportation company, didn't Marcus mention using their services during one of his interrogations?" Maya nodded. "Yes, but we haven't been able to tie him directly to any victims through them." Captain Rhodes, who had joined the meeting virtually, spoke up. "If they're connected to Marcus, it's worth investigating. I'll see if my contacts can dig deeper into their operations." The team worked tirelessly over the next several weeks, following leads and coordinating with law enforcement. The process was slow and often frustrating, but small breakthroughs kept them moving forward. One day, Claire received a call that made her heart race. "Claire? This is Detective Ramirez with the Trafficking Task Force. We've located a girl who might have been connected to Marcus Steele. She's hesitant to speak, but we thought you might be able to help." Claire's voice wavered. "Of course. Where is she?" "She's at a safe house nearby," Ramirez said. "If you're comfortable, I think she'd benefit from hearing your story." Emily accompanied Claire to the safe house, a modest building tucked away on a quiet street. Inside, they were greeted by a counselor who introduced them to a girl named Mia. Mia was 15, with haunted eyes and a guarded demeanor. She sat stiffly on the couch, her arms crossed protectively over her chest. "Hi, Mia," Claire said gently, sitting across from her. "I'm Claire. I've been where you are." Mia's eyes darted to Claire, her expression wary. "You don't know what I've been through," she said quietly. Claire nodded, her voice soft. "You're right. I don't know everything, but I know what it's like to feel scared and trapped. To think no one will believe you. But I'm here because someone did believe me, and they helped me get out. I'm here to tell you that you're not alone." For the first time, Mia's posture softened slightly. She didn't speak, but her eyes filled with tears. "You don't have to talk until you're ready," Claire continued. "But when you are, there are people who want to help. People who care." Mia nodded slowly, her fingers brushing away a tear. The encounter with Mia was both heartbreaking and hopeful. For Claire, it reinforced her belief in the importance of signals of hope's mission. Every survivor deserved to be seen, heard, and supported. As the team continued their work, their efforts began to ripple outward. Other organizations reached out, inspired by their dedication and eager to collaborate. Schools adopted trafficking awareness programs. Airlines implemented Emily's training model, and survivors like Claire became advocates for change. One evening, as the team gathered to review their progress, Emily looked around the room and felt a swell of pride. Claire was speaking animatedly with Maya about an upcoming event, Frank was reviewing case files, and Captain Rhodes was on a video call with law enforcement. "Look at us," Emily said softly, her voice filled with emotion. Frank glanced up and smiled. "From one flight to all of this. It's incredible." Claire turned to Emily, her eyes shining. "It's not just incredible, it's hopes. For me, for Mia, for everyone out there who needs someone to see them." Emily nodded, her heart full. The ripple effect of their actions was growing, touching lives in ways they could never have imagined. The conference hall buzzed with energy as Emily Harper stood backstage, clutching her notes. It had been over a year since that fateful flight, and today marked the first national summit for Signals of Hope. Representatives from airlines, advocacy groups, law enforcement, schools, and community organizations filled the room. Survivors and allies mingled, united by a shared commitment to ending human trafficking. Claire Parker sat in the front row, her hands folded in her lap, a mix of nerves and pride flickering across her face. This event was the culmination of months of tireless effort, and Claire knew how far they had come. Emily peeked out at the crowd, her heart swelling at the sight. A banner hung above the stage with the organization's slogan, "Pay attention. Act. Save lives." Frank stepped up beside her, a reassuring presence. "You've got this," he said with a smile. Emily nodded. "We all do." The event began with Captain Evelyn Rhodes delivering a stirring keynote address. She spoke of her decades in the aviation industry and how the experience with Claire had changed her perspective forever. "We often think of trafficking as something distant, something that happens in places we can't see," Rhodes said, her voice steady and powerful. "But it happens everywhere, in airports, on planes, in hotels. The first step to stopping it is recognizing it. That's why we're here today, to learn, to share, and to act." The audience erupted in applause as she left the stage, her words resonating deeply. Next, Emily and Frank led a panel discussion with law enforcement and educators, sharing the success of the airline training program and discussing how similar strategies could be adapted for schools, hospitality, and public transportation. "We've seen firsthand how small actions can create ripples," Emily said. "It's about vigilance, compassion, and being willing to trust your instincts. As the panel ended, it was time for the most anticipated part of the day, Claire's speech. Claire's palms were clammy as she walked onto the stage. The spotlight felt overwhelming, but the encouraging faces in the crowd, especially Emily's, gave her strength. Taking a deep breath, she began. 2 years ago, I thought no one could see me, Claire said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. I thought I was invisible, that I would disappear and no one would notice. But I was wrong. Someone did see me. Someone cared enough to act. And that saved my life. She paused, letting her words sink in. What happened to me was horrible, but it's not the end of my story. It's the beginning of something bigger. I stand here today not just as a survivor, but as an advocate. I'm here because I believe that we can stop this. We can save others if we're willing to pay attention and take action. The room was silent, every eye on Claire. She continued, her voice gaining strength. I've met so many amazing people who've helped me heal and find purpose. But I've also met survivors who are still struggling to find their voices. For them, and for the ones we haven't found yet, we have to keep fighting. Every life is worth saving. Every signal is worth noticing. When Claire finished, the audience rose to their feet, their applause thunderous and heartfelt. Tears streamed down her face as Emily and Frank joined her on stage, pulling her into a hug. The summit concluded with the launch of a new initiative, Signals of Hope in Action. This program would expand training efforts to international airlines, create partnerships with major transportation hubs, and fund resources for survivors like Mia to rebuild their lives. As attendees began filing out of the conference hall, many stopped to thank Emily, Claire, and the rest of the team. A young woman approached Claire, her hands trembling slightly. "Hi," the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to say thank you. Your story is mine too. And seeing you up there, it gives me hope." Claire's eyes filled with tears as she reached out to hold the woman's hand. "You're not alone," she said softly. "You're never alone." Later that evening, the core team gathered for a quiet dinner to reflect on the day's success. The conversation was filled with laughter, gratitude, and a shared sense of accomplishment. "We've come so far," Frank said, raising his glass. "From one moment of awareness on a plane to a movement that's touching lives across the country and beyond." Captain Rhodes nodded, her expression thoughtful. "This is what happens when people come together for a purpose. It's not just about us. It's about everyone we've inspired to pay attention and take action." Emily looked around the table, her heart full. It's hard to believe how much has changed since that flight. But what gives me the most hope is knowing that this is just the beginning. The ripple effect is still growing. Claire raised her glass, her voice clear and confident. "To every signal, every act of courage, and every life we save. This is what hope looks like." As the night wore on, Emily found herself standing outside, gazing up at the stars. The journey had been far from easy, but it had been worth every challenge, every late night, every tear. Claire joined her, the cool night air brushing against their faces. "Do you think we'll ever find them all?" Claire asked quietly. Emily turned to her, her expression resolute. "Maybe not, but we'll keep trying. And along the way, we'll make sure every person who needs help knows they're not alone." Claire smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. For the first time, she truly believed it. Together, they walked back inside, ready to face whatever came next. Because they knew that with courage, kindness, and vigilance, even the smallest actions could create waves of change. And those waves were already reaching shores they'd never imagined. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey of resilience, courage, and the power of paying attention. Signals of Hope reminds us that even the smallest actions can spark life-changing ripples. Together, we can create a safer, more compassionate world. If this story inspired you, please like the video, leave a comment to share your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful and uplifting stories. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Let's keep spreading awareness, kindness, and hope one story at a time. Thank you for watching.